Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and this is part 2 of answering questions. So the first question I have is from my good friend Kellen from Dream Media, and he says, how many Oreos can you eat in one sitting? And the answer, Kellen, is I'd rather not say. Probably way more than I'd want to admit, but at my age, and I'm sure your age as well, eating too many Oreos in one sitting usually means problems later on, like belly fat that I can't get rid of. Let's see. All right, so the next question comes from PK Hamu 2005. I live in an apartment with tight space and can only accommodate on-walls. Is it true that even a good on-wall cannot perform than a traditional speaker? What aspects should I be looking at while choosing an on-wall? Okay, so I'm going to answer this in a number of ways. I'm just going to say right off the bat, in theory, I think the answer is no, that's not true. In practice, it may be true to a point, but there's some caveats to that. So first, on-wall speaker is probably not going to have the low bass performance of a box speaker because the volume of the on-wall speaker is too low. But there's another problem. Nobody wants an on-wall speaker that's 2 feet deep or 1 foot deep. Or for those of you in Europe, you know, if this thing is like 1,000 millimeters deep, you know, a meter, that would be ridiculous, right? Even if it was half of it, was 500 millimeters deep, that would be ridiculous. That would be too much depth. So we try to keep it really, really low. Okay, going back to the metric, 100 millimeters is probably pretty typical, about 4 inches. And so we don't want a super deep speaker on the wall. Now, that means that the internal volume of the on-wall cabinet is low. And it also means the woofer has to be a pretty shallow woofer, which limits excursion. So the performance that you lose with an in-wall speaker or an on-wall speaker comes from that. Now, use enough of those woofers and you limit the bandwidth to the operating range that matters, like 80 hertz on up. And a lot of that is kind of a moot point. In terms of output, well, let's take the speakers I have. S7Is can do well over 120 dB. They make an on-wall box for those. It's like a mount that you put it in, so that becomes an on-wall speaker. There's the S7T and the S7I perform the same, with the exception that the S7T has more bass. If we're limiting them to 80 hertz, there's not really much of any difference between the two at that point. So I would argue that the answer to this is no, it's not true that on-wall speakers can't perform as well as box speakers. The bigger issue is there are not very many really high-performance on-wall speakers that would perform on par with good box speakers, especially at the lower price points. The other issue, and this is the more complex one. So Anthony Gramani, who I work with, has commented on this. Gene De La Salle believes strongly in this. I talked to Sean Olive about it. All of them have said, so I'll give you Gene's version and then I'll kind of give a more nuanced one. Gene's version is you cannot get the sound staging and imaging and the spaciousness and separation of instruments and depth that you get from box speakers with in-wall speakers and by product on-wall speakers. That it's not possible because it doesn't have those same reflections. Well, I talked to Sean about this and Sean said, yeah, I mean, there's reflections behind the speaker and there probably is some differences that you would hear. The physical placement of the speaker relative to the wall actually has that's not what defines depth. It's not like the farther the speaker out is, the deeper the soundstage. The argument, and what Sean seemed to be getting at, was that it is possible, but not researched, that the reflections from the front wall behind the speaker, though, may actually play a role in our perception of depth. So there is some sound, but it's mostly only mid and low frequencies. It wraps around the cabinet and goes to the back wall and comes back again. Front wall behind the speaker, though. And I think what he's saying is it's possible that plays a role, and that he too kind of holds that view without there being like a science behind it per se. Anthony says it's common wisdom. Not to say it's right, just it's something most people believe to be true. And you do have to stop and look at common wisdom and say, is the common wisdom just everybody believing in the same nonsense, or is the common wisdom actually holding some degree of truth we need to look at? And given that there's no research that says that it's wrong, you do have to stop and take a look and say, is there research that could or would support that it's right? And I guess the answer is there's not research that says one way or the other with certainty, but it does seem to suggest that there's something worth looking at because it's a common experience. Having said that, I still believe that in-wall and on-wall speakers produce plenty of image depth. And I've heard that with my own in-wall speakers. I have 2 sets that are very high performing. All right, let's see. Magic TK says, can I visit to listen to your theater room? So Magic, yes. My theater room was built and intended to be a demo space for people interested in hiring me for my services or purchasing products that I sell, which would probably involve hiring me for my services as well. And so I would be happy to host people who want to do that. It is done on a first come, first served basis, by appointment only, because it is in my home. And I do ask that if you're asking for that it's because you're interested in my services or products. If you just really want to hear the system, while I appreciate that, I just can't give up large portions of my day routinely just to show the system to people. All right, Soraku X, what is that? 13, I guess, XIII. I believe a few years ago you were planning on doing a review of the JTR 110HT. That it ever pan out? Those are the main speakers currently for LR. Would have liked to hear your extended thoughts on them. Gosh, I do remember I was reviewing them and then we called the review off and I don't remember why. Jeff took the speakers. I do think I know what it was, and maybe I should talk to Jeff about revisiting this. I took a long time, as I often do, to review, and Jeff redesigned them, I think, like 3 times. And we measured them, and they measured differently each time because he was revising and updating it, and it made it so that all my thoughts that I had put together on the original review were no longer correct, and I would have had to start over, and we just didn't bother. So, I mean, they don't have a lot of bass, and they can do down to 80 hertz, but I think that my thought at the time was they really needed a high crossover point to work optimally, but they were okay. I didn't have any major issues with them in that regard. Sound was surprisingly good in that I've heard a lot of speakers based on the same drivers from other people that I think didn't sound very good and were quite bright. These were not, which I appreciated that was true. Obviously, they're efficient, so they actually had really good dynamics, and I remember that they performed well in that regard. For the money, they're hard to beat for something that has those kinds of dynamics. As I've mentioned before, the vast majority of speakers, especially in that price point, could not actually hit reference levels in even a small room. That's a reality most people don't like to admit, but it is true. And so if you're trying to get what I think is a key dimension of realism in home theater, and often to an extent with music, there aren't a lot of great options at that lower price point that speaker hits at. And so with subwoofers, those speakers will do that. All right. DI6519. What approach do you recommend for a highly asymmetric room, like an L-shaped space where one speaker has a wall beside it and the other has no wall to the side? So obviously the best thing you can do when you've got a situation like that is to have, okay, so let me just say, if the issue is that there's a wall on one side and not on the other, but the speakers are symmetric to you, if you have symmetric placement of the speakers already and it's just the wall reflections you're dealing with, don't worry about it. Having some asymmetry in the acoustics is not necessarily a bad thing. If it's really significant, like sometimes what we'll have is a scenario where you've got a whole entire glass wall, and on that whole glass wall is curtains from one end to the other. So it's as if it's an empty black hole of a space. And on the other side, you have a regular reflective wall. I will sometimes do stuff to make the treatments on the one side more of a mix of absorption and reflection. And there's some tricks we can do with the actual curtains to get it like that. And on the left side, then I would symmetrize that. I would make it more symmetric by adding absorption and diffusion to that area to try to get something that better matches what I'm going for acoustically. And if I can get away with it, I would even do maybe like freestanding diffusers on that other wall. In an L-shaped room, you have kind of a similar situation where you've got some reflections coming in like that. As long as the L-shaped area is large enough that it's not creating weird low-frequency resonances that are kind of pumping out of there, I probably would just add some diffusion on the left side, as well as a mix of absorption to try to create better symmetry. And I would listen and adjust the treatment approach based on what I'm hearing. If it's a really small space, like the L is actually just like a door entrance, you can get a lot of booming by bass buildup happening in that area. You actually mostly hear it in there, not at your listening position, but it does occasionally cause really weird problems at the listening position too. And when that happens, then you have to treat that space. So you add some fuzz, some absorption to that space. You would not add diffusion inside the L. All right, Nakian Wycliffe, I don't know if I pronounced that right, NakeanWickliff. Apologies if I'm butchering these pronunciations. I'm ready to try the second subwoofer again. Please, can you do a video on time aligning your subs? I do think I just realized I flipped the phase on one of the two front subs, which meant they were never going to align with the main, since no matter which one I flipped to align, one would always be out of phase with the mains. So guys, remember that alignment refers to time alignment often, and phase is something different. And what we look for with subwoofers is a mixture of phase alignment and time alignment, but the term time alignment is really tricky because there's something that happens with all bandwidth limited systems, and that is as you get towards the bottom of their bandwidth, the group delay naturally increases. It doesn't matter if it's sealed or ported, that's always true, but with ported, it's going to rise much more quickly than with sealed. And when you then add a crossover, a high pass filter is going to, again, add additional group delay. So when you're trying to phase align, there's also phase rotation caused by that. So when you're trying to phase align a subwoofer to a main, you can't time align it where you would do something like that, for the sake of argument, a uncrossed over subwoofer with a bandwidth out to 1 kilohertz, and you test it 500 hertz, the peak of the impulse, and you time align that to the peak of a regular full bandwidth speaker, those will not actually be time aligned, even though the impulses are aligned with each other. Because if you look specifically at the group delay, you'll see that you've created a jump in group delay down there. So the better way to do it, and I use wavelets for this, is to make sure that the subwoofer is coming in around the same time as the bass is on the main speaker, which, as I said, is actually going to not be at 0 milliseconds. It'll be out from that by a bit, 2, 5, 10 milliseconds. If it's a lot higher than 10 milliseconds, there may be something going on, way too much processing, for instance, in the main speakers. So that should not be true. What you can have, though, is another situation, which is tricky, and that is you can have a situation where you've got more than a cycle. I've seen as much as 10 cycles, like 100 milliseconds of delay in the subwoofer. So you've got the main speaker kind of coming in, and it starts to dogleg a little bit. So it starts to curve out, and eventually it would just kind of flatline out and just keep going. So it's going to curve out a little bit. And then all of a sudden it goes way out to 100 milliseconds, and then it starts to follow a normal path again, where the subwoofer has its own natural rising group delay. That big moving out that you would see in terms of the peak time happens because the subwoofer's time alignment is way off the main. And so even though it's phase aligned and the frequency integration is very good, it's not time aligned, and that would sound lousy. So what you got to do is fix the time alignment as well as that. And like I said, I use wavelets to do that, as well as just a general understanding of how this process happens. I should do a video on it. I haven't because it's a complex topic. Let's see. I'm going to skip the next one because I think it's too specific to this individual. So then the next one after that is Richard Burgess, MD. Does the floating floor approach to maximize tactile bass assume subwoofers resting on that same floor? What if they are mounted in a baffle wall attached to the concrete underfloor or otherwise decoupled from the floating floor in some other way? Does the floating floor then still have a benefit? In other words, is the bass energy transfer... so it's not actually necessarily a direct transfer from the subwoofer to the floor. Certainly that would be more, but like just to give you an idea, in my own room, 4 of the subwoofers, which are up front, are currently sitting on the floor. 2 of the subwoofers are in the wall, in the back wall, which sits on its own decoupling on the not concrete, sorry, there's wood joists, on the wood joists. And then I've got my inner floating floor that back wall doesn't sit on. So the back wall is in no way attached to the floor. Before the 4 subwoofers were connected in the front, all I had were those rear subwoofers, and the tactile bass was insane. So the transfer was whatever limited transfer still happened through the wood joists, which probably there was some, and there would be in your scenario too, and air transfer. And so what my answer to you would be is yes, because at the end of the day, nothing changes the fact that trying to shake a concrete floor surrounded by earth is much more difficult than trying to shake, it's inertial energy, trying to shake just the floating floor. So the floating floor will always have a significant advantage regardless of the subwoofer placement. Okay, Onker X or ONCRX, how do manufacturers determine recommended power handling? Can a speaker like the Perlistens in our series handle more power than what is recommended, both sustained and for peaks? Well, okay, so remember that recommended power is what they're telling you they recommend as an amplifier rating for the speaker. It's not necessarily the max power, and that would be the amount of amplifier power that would be needed to get good, competent performance and potentially hit max output. Their max output ratings are more like a continuous max output, but the assumption is that you wouldn't actually be I mean, they would eventually overheat if you did that, the coils and the tweeters and woofers. So it's not that you would literally continuously do that. But they're not doing it through burst tests for this. So it's more of a continuous output type thing where the amplifier, though, is only hitting those peaks for a relatively short amount of time, as would be the case in music and movies. And so having said that, any decent amplifier is going to put out at least a little bit more power in the short term than it can in the long term. And so when they do a recommended power, they are assuming that there's a little bit of headroom, half a dB to a dB of headroom on that amp, if not more. Can they handle more peak? Absolutely. In fact, most speakers would be able to handle anywhere from 10 to 100 times more power than they're rated for in dynamic peaks. And it all depends on the crest factor of the signal. If that actual peak energy is extremely short in duration, then the amount of power that would be dissipated in that brief moment would be extremely high, but it wouldn't really be because it's such a short period of time. And so, you know, even amplifiers could put out ridiculous amounts of power. That's where some of those weird power ratings like PMPO came from, where it was sort of a weird way of calculating it that gives you really, really high numbers, but it's not realistic and it doesn't really explain what the amp's capable of. Same with speakers. I mean, you could rate them that way and say, it handles 10,000 watts of power. Does it? Sure, for like an extremely tiny short burst of time. So Perlistens handle quite a bit of power. The S7s, for instance, can easily handle 500 to 600 watts or more. You could probably put a 700 watt amp on them without much issue. If you're really pushing them constantly to their max with an amp of that power level, you're probably going to damage them over time. But they are a very high power handling speaker, and they absolutely thrive on 500 watts. So I actually do that quite often with them. Even mine are about 500 watts per channel right now. I'm going to do one more. All right, so William Kramer 9069 says, can you make a video talking about your feelings or beliefs on different aspects of RP22? William, that's a good idea. I was going to answer this, but I can't. That's way too complex of a topic. So yeah, we could do like maybe kind of a page turn on the standards in RP22 from CEDIA. Keep in mind, I am on RP23, which is the video one. RP22 is kind of on ice right now. I am on RP32, which is the measurement standards that go along with RP22. I am on RP1, which is the manufacturer's one. And then RP10 is the overarching group, so I'm part of that as well. And when RP22 restarts, I would imagine I would be a part of that as well. And I'm currently working to become an educator, a teacher of RP22 for folks in CEDIA. So I have my own feelings. I was not a part of the drafting of RP22, but I reviewed it, and now I am a part of the efforts afterwards. And so there's things that they did that I fully agree with, and there's things that they did that I don't fully agree with, but I believe that all the decisions they made are logical, and I am generally okay with them. So that's this video, and I'm going to do a part 3 as we go through some more. So I hope you're enjoying this.